Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moffin coming at you again with another APUSH video. We are finishing up taking a look at topic 8.14, society in transition. Now, when we are talking about the 1970s, the idea of transition is clearly going to be felt in today's video because we're going to be taking a look at how the 1970s is going to kind of bridge the sense of 1960s liberalism with 1980s conservatism. So we're going to bridge that period in the 1970s. And one of the leading figures in this period of transition will be Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court Warren Berger. Now, Berger is going to be taking over the Supreme Court in 1969 following the retirement of Earl Warren. And if you remember, Earl Warren, the most liberal U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice in our nation's history, and he's going to be setting a tone for, promoting racial integration, protection of civil liberties, focus on, protecting due process and all that kind of stuff. Now, note though, Berger is going to be a little bit more conservative than Warren, not dramatically, but in a noticeable way. And Warren is going to be one of the important justices that's going to be nominated during the Richard Nixon presidency. And note, you're going to see, with the appointments made by Nixon in the 1970s, you're going to see the beginning of what is now today a heavily dominant conservative Supreme Court. It takes a while. It takes a couple of decades to get there, but it starts in the 1970s with Richard Nixon's appointments. And so keep that in mind. It's going to starting to become more conservative, not happening overnight. And to kind of give you a sense of how this is not happening overnight is that we're going to be seeing, for example, some key rulings by the court that don't necessarily seem very conservative. For example, on the issue of forced busing, and let's kind of pause here for a moment. Forced busing was a policy initiative done by several states in an attempt to try to manifest real school integration despite the realities of white flight that had kind of dominated the 1960s. So the idea being is that per Brown versus Board, you could not intentionally by law segregate students, but because of white flight, it was still happening, in reality. You didn't need legislation to make this happening if whites and blacks are not living anywhere near each other. You're seeing whites kind of self-segregating based on where they are living. So the idea of forced busing is that you take kids in one part of a city and you take white kids in one part of a city, you take black kids from another part of a city, and you bus them. And it could be, many miles to another part of town to force that integration. Now, opponents of forced busing are really going to be upset with this idea because of the notion that, hey, I've intentionally chosen to live in this neighborhood that, has better local schools, and you're forcing my child to go to a different school than where we wanted to live in the first place. So there's going to be a lot of controversy over that, but the Supreme Court is going to rule that, if communities wanted to engage in forced busing, that was permissible because it was in essence it was an attempt to try to basically, make the spirit of the Brown ruling come into effect. We also saw the death penalty found unconstitutional in 1972. And, it was basically based on the argument at the time that the way the death penalty was being handed out was being done in a very arbitrary and a racist way. That, in other words, you didn't seem to have much of a, rubric for what would be a consistent application of issuing someone a death penalty sentence, and we saw that it was far more disproportionately applied to people of color than people that were white. Now, note, this moratorium on the death penalty only lasts for 4 years when the state of Georgia, which was the state that had been found guilty of violating the Constitution with its use of the death penalty, will file another lawsuit trying to bring it back with, stricter rules and an attempt to try to make sure that there's, equity based on race. And the court will agree. And so you kind of see this transition just between these two court cases that you see in 72, the way the death penalty was being used was unconstitutional. And then 4 years later, a sense of, okay, changes have been made, you can bring back the death penalty. But, to show that the court does not become conservative overnight is going to be probably the most well-known case of the Berger era, and that's going to be the Roe versus Wade case. Roe versus Wade was focusing in on abortion rights. Abortion was pretty much illegal in most states across America, but given the Griswold v. Connecticut ruling 8 years earlier that said that we do have an implied right to privacy via the 4th and 9th Amendments, and that Griswold case was focusing in on birth control, so there's a sense already that, privacy does involve, issues dealing with reproduction. Then the question becomes, does a woman have a right to have an abortion based on that same issue of privacy? And the court's going to say, yeah. In a 7-2, I think it's, or 6-3 ruling, the court is going to say that, a woman has an inherent right via privacy to have that abortion. It's considered a medical operation. Now, note, the court does put some parameters in terms of, what is kind of considered an acceptable range to be able to have said abortion, where that right goes. Basically, for example, they say that, third trimester abortions are not necessarily guaranteed as a right versus, say, first trimester abortions. But the idea that abortion, just in its basic sense, is an inherent right, that is going to be obviously, the most controversial decision of the last 50 years, and certainly something that is going to galvanize what is going to start to be this conservative resurgence happening in America. Roe versus Wade, in many respects, is kind of the tip of the iceberg. And as we get into the mid to the late 70s, you are seeing what had been about a generation of liberalism moving America to the left is now starting to kind of swing back the other direction. And there's this sense of more and more Americans feeling that America had gone too far to the left, had become too liberal on seemingly every issue, too liberal in terms of economics. In other words, the government had gotten too big, providing too many social welfare opportunities. It had gone too far left in a cultural sense in America, and so there was a sense that we needed to bring America back in a more conservative direction. So to kind of boil this down a little bit more, from an economic perspective, conservatives are going to argue that when you take a look at the recent Great Society policies, which was already on top of Fair Deal policies, which was already on top of New Deal policies, there was a sense that, from conservatives, that we were spending far too much money, going too far in debt to coddle people and not making them have personal accountability for their own success, that we had created a welfare society that was looking for handouts and was eroding capitalism, eroding profitability. Conservatives are going to argue that 1970s era stagflation is going to be the result of decades of liberal Keynesian economic theory that had been put in place, and that you needed to recharge the economy by cutting taxes, cutting spending, bringing back a more orthodox sense of capitalism. But from a cultural sense, conservatives are really going to be galvanized by what had happened in the last 15 to 20 years. The idea that Americans had become far too secular, that they had abandoned their traditional, mostly Christian values. Church membership had gone down in the 1960s and had gone down in the early 1970s. We had seen the sexual revolution promote promiscuity, a dramatic increase in divorces. You've seen the mainstreaming of pornography in American society. We had seen the idea of, women questioning traditional gender roles. We were, starting to be more tolerant of homosexuality. We were becoming more tolerant of drug usage. So there was just a sense that Americans, at least on the conservative side, had, fallen away from God, fallen away from traditional American values, and that we needed to bring that back to America. The idea being is that American greatness is not just based on an economic theory, but on a cultural set of values. And driving this conservatism, which is going to be really interesting. When we normally think of conservatism, it's kind of being driven mostly by, economic leaders and political leaders. But you're seeing as part of this, the promotion of conservatism in a political and cultural sense from religious leaders of the time. You're going to be seeing the next generation of TV evangelists, people like Jerry Falwell from the Moral Majority and Pat Robertson here on the right, are going to be transcending the traditional roles of being a spiritual leader and a very popular spiritual leaders on television, kind of like, to some degree, like a Billy Graham, for example. But instead of leaving politics to the politicians, these folks are saying, no, we have to take the values of the church and instill them into the politics of America. And from their perspective, it was the Republican Party that had those conservative values that they thought would save America. So you're starting to see this, religious movement of conservatism starting to, mesh with economic conservatism within the Republican Party. And so you're seeing this very powerful alliance of, Christian cultural values and economic, capitalism, starting to, go on the offensive. And it will be powerful. You are going to start to see more and more gains for Republicans in the Bible Belts, the old Dixie South, and in many rural areas. You're going to start to see what had been, in some respects, traditional kind of populist rural areas, kind of going back to the days of FDR and, Teddy Roosevelt, and even as far back as the 1890s with the populist movement. Now, very quickly, based on especially cultural values, things like drugs and abortion and, ERA and all these kinds of things, saying, hey, we need the Republican Party infused with these conservative Christian values. We even see the rise of think tanks that are specifically ideologically tied to the right starting to emerge, like the Cato Institute. And think tanks are basically professional policy creators. In other words, these are very, very intelligent academics in all sorts of fields of policy, be it economic policy, foreign policy, racial, social welfare policy, whatever, you name it. These folks are the folks that come up with the ideas that actually become laws. And so there was a sense of, we are going to, from a conservative perspective, we are going to create this new America. We're going to create the policies. They're going to bring all these cultural and economic values together and make America move to the right, and in essence save it from liberalism. And one case that kind of shows this growing sense of conservative backlash and resentment to a lot of the liberalism of the previous generation is going to be found in the Supreme Court case Bakke versus California. Now, the case of Bakke versus California focuses on the issue of affirmative action. Affirmative action was another policy that was promoted starting in the late 1960s, with the idea being that in order to make up for the legacy of past racial discrimination, that you needed to give minorities, be it on race or gender or whatever, extra consideration for opportunities in education, jobs, etc. The Bakke case stems from how the University of California's medical school was determining placement in their school through affirmative action. Their policy was to have a strict quota. The idea being is that we're going to have X% of our admissions be people of color, regardless of grades or test scores. Alan Bakke, who was white, was rejected from Cal's grad school and will claim that he was rejected despite higher test scores than many of those that were admitted based on race, and that affirmative action violated his 14th Amendment equal protection rights. In a sign that we were moving more in a conservative direction, the court will agree with Bakke, saying that he had been a victim of his 14th Amendment rights of equal protection being violated, though they do say that affirmative action is protected. You just couldn't use a quota basis for it. So we are seeing a movement to the right that we'll see expanded in the 1980s. We'll see you next time.